Well, we all know the results. Despite large amounts of money being spent by supporters, it was shot down 80-20. So, what does this mean for our state? What is going on? And how might we ever get our roads fixed? Well, Zoe Clark from Michigan Radio is going to answer all of these questions. She's going to clear it all up. Zoe Clark is co-host of It's Just Politics on Michigan Radio, as well as the executive producer of the station's daily news magazine, Stateside, with Cynthia Canty. She will give a behind-the-scenes look at how politics is or isn't currently working at the state capitol. Using Proposal 1 as an example, Clark will talk about the intra-party dynamics between Republicans, how Democrats are working to stay relevant in a GOP-controlled legislature, and what all of this means for the election in 2016 and beyond. So we are thrilled to have Zoe Clark. Please come on.
Thank you so much for having me and for that introduction. Just the idea of coming up with a road funding solution that's actually going to pass the legislature, I think makes me want to just go next door and have a drink. It's just sort of amazing to think about. So yeah, I want to talk about the roads. I could talk politics for hours and hours. I tend to, but I want to limit that this evening. I hope to answer a lot of questions. Nancy had asked me to talk for quite a bit of time. I'm happy to talk for a little bit of time, but really what I find the most interesting is your questions, what you would like to know, and selfishly that actually helps me, because then I can go back to Michigan Radio tomorrow and go, this is what we need to be covering. Here's what folks want to know more about, or here are the issues, or sometimes even, wow, why had I not thought to ask lawmakers so-and-so that question? So I have an easy job up here tonight, because as political reporters, our jobs, as we like to say, are after elections, we come down from the battlefield and just sort of bayonet the wounded, right? We go, oh, we could have seen that happening. Oh, you should have done this instead. And the biggest issue here, I think the biggest wounded out of all of this are not so much the lawmakers, but all of us, right? The citizens who are still driving on Michigan's crumbling roads. There is one thing that everyone in Lansing can agree on, and everyone on every side that I've talked to, is the fact that the roads need to be fixed. I have heard very few people who believe that that is an untruth. Most folks in Lansing also agree on the number, right? Somewhere between about $1.2 billion up towards about $2 billion a year. That's one of the things Proposal 1 would have done, and as Nancy said, it went down in defeat. I will fully admit, go on record, that I thought it would get defeated. Nowhere near the numbers it did. I was guessing about 67%, and as Nancy said, 81 in 4. I mean, just kind of smithereens. It just, I mean, we were thinking of all the cliches the day after for just how down in fire it went. So let's talk about the wounded, right? Because that's what I like to do in politics, talk about the gamesmanship. Rick Pluta and I, my co-host of It's Just Politics, often like to say, you know, we're not It's Just Policy, we're It's Just Politics. So let's sort of talk about the gamesmanship for a little bit. One of the losers is going to be Governor Snyder. Took office, of course, January 1st, 2011. In October of that same year, he gave his special messages on roads and infrastructure. He said this was his top priority. This had to get done. So that was four years ago. So for someone whose top priority wanted to get that done, it was on his agenda, no pun intended. He wanted to get that done. He did not. And he spent the past 6 months, when he was hoping to actually do some other things, having to be the cheerleaders for a major proposal that he wasn't even hugely happy with in the beginning. So bummer for him. For Republicans, It's hard to see that this was anything but an incredible lack of leadership in Republicans. I asked a Republican lawmaker recently, how can you say that this isn't a Republican problem when you have both chambers of the state legislature controlled by Republicans? The governor, a Republican. The Supreme Court has not had to rule on any issues about Prop 1, but controlled by Republicans. Explain that this is not a lack of leadership or this is not a Republican problem. He couldn't answer that. Finally, Democrats. As Nancy said, one of the issues that Democrats are dealing with in Lansing right now is relevancy. How do they remain relevant, particularly in the state Senate, where the Republicans not only have a majority, but a super majority, 3/4 of Republicans. There are now, as Jack Lessenberry, who I was first interned with and produced for many years, likes to say, all of the pizza caucus, because all of the Democrats could now order one large pizza and it would feed them all. And fit probably in a large van together to go pick it up. So totally stealing Jack Lessenberry's line there. Democrats now, what do they do? What can they bring to the table? How can they, and I use this word in political love, but how can they manipulate the conversation? I had a thesis going into Prop 1 that would Democrats, although many of them pushed for Prop 1 publicly, would they really be so bummed, so unhappy if Prop 1 failed? Let me pause at that theory there for a second. Governor Snyder needs Democrats right now. Republicans are not ready to throw in more money for roads by raising revenue. Again, Republicans believe that we need $1.2 to $1.5 billion. Many Republicans believe it's in the state budget, that we can cut some places, we can move some money around and do it that way. So the governor needs Democrats. He needed Democrats to get Proposal 1 on the ballot. One of the reasons that I think the ballot went down in flames, another political metaphor and cliche that we'll just keep going on here, was this idea that it was called a Christmas tree. It had too many ornaments, that if it had just been one question, can we increase money for roads, that it at least would have had a fighting chance. But that the issue here was that there were too many other things, and maybe they were things that folks really supported. More money for education, polls really well. Restoring some money to the Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC for the working poor. Again, something that polls very well, particularly probably in a community in Ann Arbor. And I guess if I asked you, a lot of folks would if they wanted to raise their hands and tell us, yeah, separately we believe in that. But why are we doing this when what we want fixed is the roads? Well, why that happened again was because Democrats weren't ready to help the governor. They weren't ready to help Republicans in the final hour of lame duck back in December. Put this ballot issue in May on the ballot without getting something in return. The other issue, of course, is increasing the sales tax, which Prop 1 would have done from 6% to 7%. That's considered regressive, right? That then folks who are still making less money paying the same amount. So that was another issue that Democrats felt very strongly about. So I posit again, is this so bad for Democrats? Now, here we are again in a bargaining position. What comes next? The governor is still committed, I believe will continue to be committed on a roads funding solution. I don't see how he cannot. And who is he going to look to? Well, probably some moderate Democrats if he's actually going to get a coalition, because he's certainly right now not going to get some really conservative Republicans. Senator Jack Brandenburg, for example, who's just absolutely said no new tax revenue, no new taxes, no matter what that means. One of the interesting dynamics, too, about these election results, a lot of you were nodding your head, I noticed when I said this Christmas tree idea, too much, weighing it down with all, these special interests, or however you want to call it, if you want to call it, 8-year-old, 9-year-old kids special interests, so, however you want to describe it, is the concern for some who are saying, the reason that Prop 1 went down is because folks don't want new tax revenue. And that's a fair argument to make. Is that the right argument, though? Is that really what it was? I'm seeing, again, a lot of folks nodding their heads that no, it was this idea that, again, it wasn't a solution just for roads. Another thing when I was out in the community talking a lot about, and I wonder if Nancy or Susan, I believe it was, who went out in the community, another thing folks, I think, voted it down, was they didn't like that, the word I heard a lot was punted. They didn't like that lawmakers couldn't come up with a solution, that they had to look towards the voters. And that this was this last minute solution that was like, you know what, kick it to you guys all decide if you want to raise your taxes or not. I will explain one quick little thing which I think sometimes got lost in the message, although I know this is a very smart crowd and probably doesn't need explaining, but because of the state constitution, an increase in the state sales tax does need a vote by the voters. It does need to be okay. So no matter what, if that was part of another ballot, again, that part would have to go to the voters. But I think it is fair for folks who say, you know, lawmakers punted on certain aspects. Absolutely, because they don't want to have to be the ones to go back in district and say, I took that vote. And there's some reasons for that we can all talk a little bit more about. So now where are we? Well, now we're in the middle of May. We've already most likely lost a season of road construction money, just how it's divvied out. So roads are probably only going to get worse, if we can even imagine such things. And what we were hearing now is Governor Snyder saying he's still committed to a solution, although my guess is, politically speaking, we'll see him start pulling back a teeny bit from being the face of that. He was such the cheerleader and so out front that my guess is right now he's going to let Republican lawmakers in both the State House and Senate work it out a little bit before he comes forward with any more proposals. Plus, I don't know how many more proposals he can actually come forward to. Rick Pluta and I joked that this wasn't Prop 1. This was like proposal 251. You know, that they've tried everything. So lawmakers now are saying, hey, we're going to work through the summer. We're going to stay in town, which, you know, as I've been joking, maybe that actually is covered, because how many of them actually want to go back in district over the summer? You people, so angry. Maybe they're like, yes, actually, please let us work through the summer. We'll stay here. It's air conditioning. You feed us. We have staff that does what we want. So we have the state Senate. We have Senator Mike Kowal. He is the Republican floor leader. He told reporters last week, hey, if we have to work through September to come up with a plan, we're going to do it. House Republicans, a little more iffy on that. I don't know if they have some sort of magic fairy dust that they think they've got in a bag that they'll sprinkle around, because I think they actually think they could come up with a deal by the end of June, which I just think is so cute. And hey, if it happens, we'll all be the first to clap. But I don't think anyone in this room should start holding their breaths for that. Usually how it works in Lansing is they'll figure out the budget by hopefully June 1st is sort of the self-imposed deadline lawmakers have given since Snyder took office. Usually they finish up a little bit more business by the end of June, and that's when in-district recess period happens again. So we would have to then see a road deal before July if they weren't going to stay through the summer. I think the real question is what makes them think, if they haven't been able to do this for the past 4 years, are the next 2 months really going to suddenly come up with that giant pool of money? And if so, don't you also want to go, well, like, why didn't you think about that for the past 4 years? Makes you a little concerned, possibly. So that's, I guess, sort of the table setting that I want to lay, but I'm hoping that everyone brought, you know, food to the picnic and wants to ask questions and have a little bit of a dialogue and question. So please, feel free, I don't know if you want to raise your hands or shout them out. I've got decent hearing. So, yeah, Susan.
I've heard that Michigan Chamber of Commerce is thinking about putting something on the ballot in the special election. Do you know about that?
Yeah, sure. So I talked to Rich Studley about this. Rich Studley is the president and CEO of the Michigan Chamber of Commerce. Last year we talked to him, and he has been really pushing for a roads funding solution. And they've laid out some things, some sort of guidelines, right? So there's some ingredients that they'd like to see, that they think it needs to, you know, be about $1.2 to $2 billion a year, and that it shouldn't take too much from this. And so they've sort of thrown some things out there. And then, interestingly enough, back in December, when it was getting to sort of fish or cut bait time for lawmakers before the end of lame duck, and maybe I missed a little bit of that part, but as you all know, the lame duck legislative session was going to be over at the end of the year, which meant if they didn't come up with a solution, it would get pushed back into this new legislature where there were even more conservative Republicans. And so there was some talk in Lansing, particularly among Governor Snyder, Randy Richardville, the former Republican Senate leader, that we need to get this deal done in lame duck, and thus why we saw the just sort of express of Prop 1. So then Rich Studley at the end of December, or actually it was early December, put out this interesting press release where he said, you know, dear lawmakers, add a little fuel to the fire under their feet, if you don't do something, we're going to think about it. the chamber, we'll put a proposal out there. We don't know what the proposal's gonna be. He wasn't ready to quite tell us, but we're gonna think about doing something. So that was an interesting dynamic. Then we saw Prop 1, but then what happened after lawmakers came out with Prop 1 is the Michigan Chamber of Commerce, which tends to be very, this is a group of folks who work for businesses in the state, tends to be pretty lockstep with this governor. Weeks went by, it was crickets, about whether or not the Michigan Chamber of Commerce was going to endorse Prop 1. And this was somewhat Rich Studley's job, and he was put in a hard political position. That the chamber as an organization is saying we need to fix the roads, but they too did not like the Christmas tree, all of the ornaments. And so they decided weeks and weeks later that they were neither going to oppose it, nor were they going to support it. They were going to remain neutral. And again, I don't want to say that these are, chapters or stories of cowardice, because one thing I like to say is, who hasn't worked for your own benefit in a job, right? When you're at work, when have you haven't thought, I want to make sure I'm going to keep my job. And you've kept to do things legally, you're keeping to do things ethically. Lawmakers, they're doing the same thing for good or for bad. And this is not me standing up here defending them, certainly, I just want to sort of put that out there, that they're keeping their own, they're watching their own skin in the game. And so did the Michigan Chamber of Commerce, and I think what happened is they take votes as a board, and they could not come to an agreement, whether they were going to support it, whether they were going to oppose it. We could see now, again, the chamber come out and decide to put a ballot, or a question on the ballot. I don't see that happening anytime soon. Now that we have the same legislature, a new same legislature for the next year and a half, the timing, the momentum of needing to get it done right this second has changed. So I could see the Michigan Chamber maybe after this summer session, maybe after the fall session, maybe thinking about early next year, which is just sort of like, oh my gosh, it's just so sad that we're already talking about a solution not happening till next year, but maybe that's what it's going to take, right? One more bad pothole season. One more year of angry voters going, I cannot believe that you said you were going to work through the summer, then there was the fall, and you didn't do it. So that's where I think the Michigan Chamber is right now. I'm going to the Mackinac Island Policy Conference next week, which is where all of the lawmakers, CEOs, those in business have a stake, and Rich will likely be there, and I'll probably tap him on the shoulder and ask him that exact same question, because he's a good barometer of how Governor Snyder is doing with his base, right? Because those are Governor Snyder's peeps. Those are his, those are his guys. So it'll be interesting to see what Rich has to say now with the failure of Prop 1. I mean, he's come out and said they're disappointed, but we'll see if he decides to take a proactive step or not. Yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, so it seems as if we're going to lose another whole season of road repair. I mean, weren't they?
Yeah. It's like I sort of laugh out of exasperation. It's not funny.
Because this whole summer, roads could have been repaired and they're not.
Yeah, so there is a certain amount of roads money still. I mean, let's be really clear that every year there still is money to fix the roads in the budget. And we're still getting matching money from the federal government. Part of how that works is in order to get federal government money, we need to say, hey, DC, we're spending this amount. So road repairs will get done to an extent. The issue is, though, maintaining bridges that are just in terrible condition, and as you've seen, the potholes. And that's one of the concerns, too, is that this actually kind of creates this exponential problem, because it's not necessarily 1.2 to 1.8 billion, whatever number you want to use, every year. Every year you don't do it, that number is going to get worse and worse because the roads deteriorate more and more. And the longer you take, the more money it takes to fix the roads. A report just came out today that said Michigan roads, rural roads, are the worst in the entire country. Yeah.
So I would have expected by this time that the Lansing Republicans would already be saying it failed because those darn Democrats added all of those ornaments to the tree. Have you heard that yet? Do you expect it to be when the first bridge collapses somewhere, somebody says before the next election, we could have had it done if those Democrats hadn't done X, Y, and Z?
Sure, and I think some Republicans have started to come out and say that hey, you know, look, this is, again, this idea that if we hadn't have had all of, you know, those extra things, we would have been able to pass it. Here's the issue about that, though. Had there not been all of those extra things, that question wouldn't have been on the ballot. There were not enough Republicans to get just a question on roads on the ballot. So it's a very much a catch-22, right? This idea that, okay, if it had just been about the roads and we had gotten on the ballot, it would have passed, but they couldn't even physically get it, legally, I should say, get it on the ballot because there weren't enough Republican votes. Again, thus going into this idea of are Democrats now going to be in somewhat of a power position and work with Snyder? Another political theory I sometimes posit is, would Governor Snyder truthfully be happy? And would more actually get done if we had what we saw in the Granholm years that wreaked so much havoc, which was that she was a Democrat working with a Republican state Senate? But would things work better if we actually had Democrats in charge of, let's say, the state house? It's much more likely than the state Senate because of how districts are drawn right now. And what would that mean? Sometimes I wonder, would Governor Snyder like that a little better, right? He could go to some of those moderate Democrats, he could work with them, then go to the Senate and go, well, we've got this plan. These are things I think about falling asleep at night. Nerd I am. So, did I answer your question? I mean, I think, yes, some of Republicans will absolutely say that, right? It was because of the Democrats. We have heard some of that, and Democrats will go, hey, we were doing our part. We were looking out for the people that we were looking out for. And I don't think any Democrats would stand up and say, we shouldn't have done what we did. Yeah.
Our own Ann Arbor Mayor has sort of floated an idea of a city tax to pay for roads. And somewhere on the news I heard that some other city was considering that. Maybe they're more, is that something that the politicians wanted to happen, or is this grass or roots or rootier grass or something?
Well, right, and it's a good question. We're seeing some of that with social issues right now. I mean, look at LGBT ordinances. Look at issues about how much marijuana you can, legally have in different areas. Would lawmakers like that maybe each town or something like that did that? Yes, but what it doesn't solve, of course, is the problem with the freeways and the highways, which also are in
this line between Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti road stops or something.
And what does that say then about our society, right? Yet again, going to cities where, we have these beautiful libraries in one city because some cities, are willing to pay millages for that. Or we have schools that are so good because one community feels like, I'm willing to pay taxes for that. And then right next door, the next community isn't. Is that a solution? It could be. But I think then again, it says so much more about who we are, and is that the kind of state and society that we want to live in? But really good question. Yeah.
So that the whole issue of schools is. When you talk about our having the worst roads in the nation, we used to have among the very best schools in the country, and we're down around with Alabama and Mississippi now. And I wonder why it isn't a matter of pride or shame with our legislature that they won't look at that and really begin to think about what has happened.
Well, I'm gonna change the question a little bit, which is I think that I think everyone is aware of those statistics. When I talk to lawmakers, both Democrats and Republicans, they will all come up with that point. The issue is what they see the solutions be. So the Democratic solution tends to be put more money into our schools. So, let's increase money for K through 12. Let's stop taking money out of the school aid fund for one thing and let's keep it there. And what you'll hear from some Republicans, let's say charter school advocates, right, is that, oh no, the solution is to create more charter schools. more virtual schools, more online schools. So I absolutely agree that I think everyone in Lansing agrees that schools, I mean, you have to agree, it's the data, it's the fact, it's sad facts. I think the issue that you get at is how each side thinks about how to fix that problem. And one side is, let's throw, I don't use the word throw, let's put more money into public education, how we used to see it, and others are, let's start looking at different ways of educating our students. Yeah.
And so far, the data is not very favorable on the charter school side of being superior to public schools with end product.
And we know, of course, too, that the Detroit Free Press, it was now a year and 3 months ago, did some really amazing investigative work about the way that charters are operating here in this state and the oversight that there is. And there was a big push now in Lansing to create more oversight system for some of these charter schools. So education is another, an education policy, you probably all maybe been following too, it's something we've been following very closely at Michigan Radio. All of the new tests that students are taking. I know, it's pretty, I mean, I get to spend my days reading the news and reading about policy, and I still sometimes have trouble understanding which tests it is that each year, each grade is taking. So education policy is another one that is huge in Lansing right now. But again, I think it goes to how you look at it and what you think the fix is.
I think Michigan has more for-profit charter schools than any other state in the country.
We do. Yeah, and some of the fewest amount of sort of oversight and some restrictions. Education Trust Midwest is a group that's doing a lot of work looking at charters. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and Google them. They're doing interesting work looking at accountability and things like that. Yeah, you had a question for all.
Well, besides, I guess I was also thinking, like, besides funding from the voters, like the taxpayers for the roads, I wonder, like, I mean, in my mind, like, the heavy users of the roads I also think of as being, like, the 18-wheeler kind of trucking companies, and I wonder what the effect of term limits are on that, because the lobbyists for, say, trucking companies, they don't have term limits, but the legislators do, and so the power kind of ends up shifting.
Yeah, well, I'm going to just steal a lot of lines from folks that I like to meet. Susan Demas is a columnist at MLive who says, one of the problems with Michigan, which I think there are very few, being born and raised here and having it dear to my heart, is that we are a peninsula. I don't think that's a problem. What is the joke? 4 out of the 5 Great Lakes, like us, for us. But it means that trucks, they don't have to drive through Michigan. Right? There's a lot of other ways to get from destinations. And so one of the ways that we attract those truckers and thus their business at gas stations and hotels is to come on our roads. And one of the ways that we do that is weight limits and having, maybe having to spend less on those. So weight limits absolutely, I think, will be part of the conversation in any next road funding debate. It was actually part of Prop 1, and I believe it will be again. In terms of your question about term limits, I think there are very few people who watch Lansing as close, as I do, and folks who work in the Capitol Press Corps who would say that, and who have amazing institutional knowledge, much more than my own, would say that term limits have been good for the way that Lansing works. I've talked to some really just smart minds who have, worked since the Milliken years, who say that's exactly the problem. Is right now lobbyists know more about an issue than any given lawmaker. And how would that not be the case? I mean, you're serving for 6 years. These lobbyists have been, working for decades. And one of the problems with term limits is, I think for most folks, it sounds really good, right? Like, yeah, we don't want any of these, these full-time politicians doing, they get easy and they're just wined and dined. And just some of that happened, yes. But they also were able to create friendships with one another. And they knew more than the lobbyists. Joe Schwartz is an amazing mind who talks a lot about this. He was in the state legislature for a long, long time before he was a congressman. He's also a doctor, still practices out in Battle Creek. Who will say, you know, that's one of the biggest fundamental problems, because he just says we wouldn't have been in a situation like we are right now with the roads. At a certain point, the Democrats or Republicans, you know, maybe it would be a round of golf. It's, again, very politically cliche. Maybe it would have been over dinner at someone's house, but we would have sat down and we would have come up with a solution, because that was what we needed to do. It was the right thing to do. It was what we needed to do, and we were going to do it for the people. And that's just not happening now. And I think term limits, one of the huge reasons why, I have that scribbled in my notes, term limits capitalized and underlined a few times, because that is at its core one of the biggest issues. Yeah.
When the league spoke to our group before the election, they pointed out that, I believe, that for the first year and into the second year, money would not be available for the roads because we had to pay off the bonded indebtedness.
You're absolutely right. That was one of the things that folks who were very against it, Paul Mitchell, who ran one of the campaigns that had just sort of like this really long name that I can't remember, you know, the say no to special interests, so he was one of the heads of one of the 4 really outspoken groups against this, and that was one of the things he said was, hey, for the first couple of years, we're just paying down debt that we have, and that's absolutely true. That also works in a lot of different ways. I mean, that's what they're talking, and this is a little bit of an aside, but the Governor Snyder right now is talking about a possible plan for the Detroit Public Schools, and sort of separating it actually into these 2, the old DPS, the new DPS, one sort of like what happened with GM, interestingly enough, and the old one simply is going to exist to start paying down debt. Yeah.
So I understand that there is a plan to switch electoral college votes to the congressional districts, and we may not be the only blue state that is looking at this, and that as a lame duck agreement on Prop 1, the Republicans agreed to shelve that, but now that Prop 1 has failed, where does that stand?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Also, another so-called agreement that some of what the Democrats got out of this, word on the street is that they were told that the legislature wouldn't pass prevailing wage legislation. And guess what the state Senate just did? Passed prevailing wage legislation. The governor still says that that's not something, again, not on his agenda. All the Democrats were quick to say,
How can you believe a
that
liar?
sounds pretty familiar. So that's going to be interesting to see. My guess is all bets are off now. Everything's back on the table. There was a push, and I think a lot of folks thought that we could see it in lame duck if we were going to. That's when we would. And there are also quite a few different proposals out there. There was the Pete Lund proposal, which would have done it by congressional district. Then there were some other proposals that would have done it more by percentage. But all of them would have meant that if any of those proposals were in place in 2012, of course Obama won Michigan 16 electoral college states, all of them meant that Mitt Romney would have, I believe, won at least 7 of those electoral college votes had any of these proposals been in place. So it's going to be something that we're all keeping an eye out. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Which brings us to redistricting.
Yeah.
Is there any?
You got to thank you from the front of the crowd.
Is there anything that's going that direction?
Yeah. Well, so what we know about redistricting is it happens every 10 years because of course it's based on the census, which happens every 10 years. And part of why, the state house and the state senate and Congress or congressional delegation, the reason it looks like why it does is because Republicans were in charge of those maps in 2011. and then they had a governor to sign them into place. So we will see come 2020 what the state house, what the state senate looks like, who the governor is at that point of time, and what the maps look like. Part of the issue there, at least in terms of federal and our congressional and federal congressional delegation, of course, is that Michigan's losing population. And so for the past few censuses, we've lost representatives. You probably all remember just that, at least in this area, just that heated battle in 2002 between Lynn Rivers and John Dingell. Just sort of knockout fight was, because Michigan's losing population. And so that'll be another question is by 2020, what does our census look like? And will we lose another member of our congressional delegation? And what will then that look like too? I'm going to just check time really quick. So time for maybe one more question?
One or two
Yeah,
more.
yeah, sure. Yeah.
Is there any role for increasing the gas tax? I mean, I've read about all the pros and cons, progressive, uneven,
Yeah.
low, but is there any
I mean,
role for that at all?
Again, it goes to this idea of increasing tax revenue. I mean, it's something that Governor Snyder has pushed for. It was part of Proposal 1 is changing. Exactly. I don't think it's dead, certainly, the idea. I think we were also answering your question, the gentleman in the back there, about use tax, right? That is, there's some way for folks who use the roads more to pay more. Now, I'm not so much even talking about truckers, but there's also talk about that. Of course, I don't see toll roads happening here in Michigan, but somehow, could we do it that the gas tax makes sense, right? The more you drive, the more you pay for the roads, and that was the issue why some folks really didn't like Proposal 1 is, let's say, someone who, doesn't even own a car, maybe use a Zip car every now and then, or Uber, is suddenly going to be paying 7% sales tax to go to the roads instead of 6%, and I think a lot of people didn't feel like that was fair. Whether or not we want better roads, just fundamentally didn't think it was fair. Yeah.
I wonder, the cars are getting like double the gas mileage.
And this is part of the problem.
That has to be a big part of the problem.
It is. Rick Cluta and I did a story, I think, in February, which is something like, why your Prius is to blame for our bad roads. Being a little tongue in cheek, but this is part of the problem, and this is also part of the problem why that number is going to keep getting steeper. Because as more people, particularly in places like Ann Arbor, are buying Priuses, are buying much more fuel-efficient vehicles, and buying less gas, where are we going to find the money for the roads? And this is yet another part of why this equation is so complicated. Yeah.
Well, they should be able to compensate for that in the licensing, though. If you've got a Prius, you pay more in your license.
And that's something that Governor Snyder has pushed for. That was actually one of the first things that he pushed for back in 2011 was an increase in car registration fees. And very quickly, a very smart Republican, who I was just speaking to a couple weeks ago, and I did not realize this until a couple weeks ago, that he was the one who made the name infamous. He called it the birthday tax. Because when do you go to the Secretary of State to do that? On your birthday. So I just thought, oh, Matt, you're so good, because I had mentioned we were on a panel, and I said, well, one of the reasons it went down is because it had that fabulous name, it was instantly disliked by everyone, that, here's your birthday, and he goes, okay. Yeah.
What I was going to say is whether or not you personally drive a lot of miles, we all get goods and services through the roads. I mean, so really, everybody should be paying for the roads.
Well, and then there's the idea of what you're saying, which, right, like, let's say you do own a bike, and, well, you can, potholes are just as bad for bikes. Yeah, and again, it goes to the question we were talking about earlier about paying each individual community, like, what do we want our roads to look like as a society? And is that how we want to start paying for things? Well, I use it more, so you pay more, or is it more about, okay, maybe I don't go to the library as much, but I still believe in, a library is important for my community. So even though I have a Kindle, and that's how I buy all my books, I'm still going to vote yes, because I believe that, a strong community needs a strong library. And this goes back to fundamentally where we are as a society right now about paying taxes and what we believe is important for any given community. Yeah.
Okay, from your point of view, who do you see as the up-and-coming leaders in Michigan as we look to 2016 and the next governor?
That's a really good question, and the funny thing is, I think what we're going to see is probably, at least on the Republican side, quite a few of the same names. I think right now the names being bandied about for governor are going to be obviously the Lieutenant Governor, Brian Calley, although we're starting to hear some signs that he may not be as interested as we previously thought, and some of that could be because of one gentleman, our Attorney General, Bill Schuette, who everyone is just pretty, I don't think there would be anyone in Lansing who would bet against the fact that he's running. He's even started fundraising, although he won't say what it's for, but if you're a term-limited Attorney General, it's hard to think about why you're flying to DC to do fundraising unless it's for higher office. So that's pretty certain that he'll run. And then a recent name that's gotten in the mix that wasn't up until, I would say, 4 months ago is Candace Miller, the Republican Congresswoman from Michigan's 10th District. She has been the Congresswoman there for years and years and surprised many when she said she wouldn't run again. And after 2014's just sort of blowout of 134 years of combined experience between John Dingell, Dave Camp, Mike Rogers, all of these congressmen who left in 2014, and now that we have 5 new freshman faces. Interesting to think that Candace Miller could be one of a candidate for governor. She's not said that she's not going to run, and there's some talk that that might be something she wants to do. On the Democratic side, there's names floated about, but I think this is the problem that the Democrats are having right now. We saw it with Virg Bernero, and we also saw it with Mark Schauer, who up until, I remember talking to Mark Schauer, and he was not sure he really wanted to run. We as reporters were talking to him about it. He said, I have to really think about it. I'm a grandpa. Is that really what I want to do right now? So I think Democrat struggles right now are going to find people who have name recognition, who can be that strong Democratic voice. And because of how Democratic politics in Michigan work, that unions and labor are going to be for. Okay, well, I think I've done enough talking for all of
One of the things that our league does is we give our guest speakers not exactly Wonder Woman, but Defender of Democracy T-shirts.
I love it. It's funny when you were talking about some of the policies that as a grassroots organization you really push for. It sounded like something that I would say exactly about Michigan radio and NPR and public radio, right? Not saying what to think, but just trying to give you the fundamental bullet points about here's what you need to make up your mind. So I feel very much lockstep in what all of you are doing with the mission of public radio as well. So thank you for all the work that you do in the community.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. A wonderful question.